Well, this morning I'd like to begin by giving you a little quiz. And it's not a quiz on what you understand about the second coming. It's simply a little quiz to help you to determine how literally you interpret three simple questions. How literally do you interpret these three questions? The first is, how many days of the week begin with the letter T? How many days of the week begin with the letter T? The second question is, how many seconds are there in a year? And the third question is, what is God's first name? I will give you a couple seconds to think that through. Well, the first question, how many days of the week we begin with the letter T? You say, well, that's pretty obvious. The right answer is 2. Everybody knows that. And it's Tuesday and Thursday. Well, you're right, but there's another group who agrees that the answer is 2, but they believe that the days are today and tomorrow. Who's right? How many seconds are there in a year? Well, you probably got your calculator out and did some quick calculations, and after doing some simple math, you figured out that the answer is 31,556,952 seconds in a year. But the other group says, not even close. There are only 12. You go, what? Yeah, January 2nd, February 2nd, March 2nd. Well, this is an easy one. What is God's first name? Well, everybody knows that God's first name is Yahweh or Jehovah in the Old Testament, and Jesus in the New Testament. But this other group says, nope, God's name is Andy. Like in the song, Andy walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. You see, on the one hand, our gut tells us that there's something wrong with that other group's answers. Well, on the other hand, we're not quite sure what that is because their answers do seem to make some sense. And after all, they're the ones who insist that they interpret these questions literally. Well, what's wrong with their answers is an example of a logical fallacy known as equivocation, or the fallacy of ambiguity. And that's when an ambiguous word or phrase is misconstrued to support a dubious conclusion. It confuses us, because words don't all have the same meanings. The point of our little quiz is that this is precisely how many of today's self-proclaimed last days experts have reached their conclusions about events leading up to the glorious return of Jesus Christ. I suppose we could call them the equivocators. And it explains why there's so many competing views of the second coming. Now, last week we looked briefly at the various views of the millennium and identified several key details that everybody can agree on. How those things are interpreted, however, and defined depends on the underlying assumptions about the order and timing of those details and how they fit together and how they unfold. So we want to be sure that our assumptions lead us to conclusions that are based on what the Bible says concerning the second coming. So this morning, to that end, we're going to hear from the world's foremost authority on the second coming, and that's Jesus himself. And the text that we're looking at this morning is Matthew 24, known as the Olivet Discourse. Now, granted, this is a long passage of Scripture, and so we're not going to be able to drill down on every single detail, but I do want to hit some of the high points as we go through this to maybe help you get the big picture of what's going on in this discourse that Jesus is giving and that Matthew has recorded for us. Just an outline here. First, there's the unthinkable prediction in verses 1 through 3, then the unprecedented birth pains in verses 4 through 14, then unmistakable events in verses 15 through 26, and undeniable signs in verses 27 through 25, and then unexpected timing in verses 36 through 39. Now, a little background here, first of all, just the setting. In Matthew 23, Jesus had just publicly humiliated two groups of elite and powerful religious leaders, an impromptu Q&A at the temple. They were the Sadducees and the Pharisees who thought they could entrap and discredit Jesus in the eyes of the people with their deviously loaded questions. But Jesus, as he often did, turned the tables on them. Matthew tells us that Jesus answers their questions so thoroughly, and he put them in their place so convincingly that no one dared to ask him any more questions. They just, shut my mouth after his answers. But Jesus wasn't finished. He went on the offensive and proceeded to publicly call out the scribes and Pharisees as hypocrites and posers by loudly pronouncing 7 woes upon them right there in the temple in front of everybody. And he wasn't very nice about it either. He called them snakes and a brood of vipers, blind guides of the blind, fools, whitewashed tombs full of dead man's bones, greedy, self-indulgent, unclean vessels, full of lawlessness, murderers, and children of hell. Gentle Jesus, meek and mild. Sounds like he's a little ticked off to me. And that brings us to our passage this morning in Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly, I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Now, I think Jesus was still fuming a little bit. And the disciples may have been trying to diffuse the situation by just assuming the role of tour guide. Let's just lighten the mood a little here. So they start pointing out all the beautiful buildings as they're leaving the temple complex and walking the quarter mile or so over to the Mount of Olives. And you see what his response is. He says, "You see all these? Do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Now, this is a shocking revelation on a number of levels. One is that Jesus had just verbally taken the religious leaders to the woodshed and told them that their house was left to them desolate. And now he tells his disciples that that house, the temple, will be destroyed, literally torn down, stone by stone until there's nothing left. Complete desolation. Another reason is that the temple was the crown jewel of Israel's national identity as the people of God. So to speak against the temple was considered to be a sacrilege, if not outright blasphemy. So in this declaration of the destruction of the temple in verse 2, this is what prompted the disciples' question now in verse 3. They made the little quarter-mile trek across the Kidron Valley and were now on the Mount of Olives, perhaps in the Garden of Gethsemane. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, verse 3, the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Now, they're asking 2 very closely related questions. One is, when will these things be, referring to the destruction of the temple? And 2, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Now, their questions are closely related because to the disciples' way of thinking, the destruction of the temple was so unthinkable that if it were to happen, it would surely be a sign of the end of the world. So you can see how these 2 questions are linked in their thinking. Jesus answers the second part of their question first in Matthew 24 by giving us this panoramic view of future events that will take place between that moment and the end of the age. This is a broad view of the future. He also indicates that there's going to be a delay before the end. In fact, it's a significant delay during which his followers will suffer tribulation, persecution, betrayal, and even martyrdom before he returns. And he describes these things as birth pains in verses 4 through 14. And Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. We hear anything like that today? Terrorist attacks, armed insurgencies, civil wars, tribal wars, religious wars, declared wars, saber rattling from countries like Iran, North Korea, China, Russia. It's difficult to name a country that isn't either fighting a war or is preparing for war. And that hasn't just happened. That's been going on for thousands of years, literally. He says, see that you are not alarmed by these things, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. There are two warnings here. See that you're not led astray, and do not be alarmed. So that's kind of an anchor for us when we look at this world that just seems to be coming apart at the seams. Don't be led astray, and don't be alarmed. In addition to these wars and rumors of wars, there are other things that are going to be happening as well. Verse 7, he says, for nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. Now, nations are ethnic groups. There's going to be racial division and racial strife. Kingdoms are sovereign states, one country against another country. Famines are food shortages caused by poor harvests and crop failures. They can be the result of economic conditions like in Venezuela, adverse weather conditions, natural disasters, war, or infestation by plant-killing bugs and diseases. There will also be earthquakes in various places. Notice he doesn't say there will be an increase in the number of earthquakes. The USGS reports that there are approximately 500,000 detectable earthquakes around the world each year. And that 100,000 of those can be felt, and out of those, 100 of them can cause damage. Now, what they've noted as significant is not the number of earthquakes, but that many earthquakes are occurring in places that normally don't have earthquakes. Earthquakes in various places, and they seem to be getting stronger in magnitude. Now, in verse 8, Jesus says, all these things are but the beginning of birth pains. They're not the end yet. And like birth pains, they increase in frequency and intensity over time. Verse 9, Jesus says, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my sake. Now, when we look at the church history, we find that all but one of the apostles were martyred for their faith. And this persecution continues today. Did you know that there were more Christians martyred in the 20th century than there were in the previous 19 centuries combined? Christians are now considered to be the most persecuted religious group in the world. The Catholic News Agency reported in January of 2017 that the number of Christian martyrs tripled in the previous 2 years to nearly 100,000 a year. That's one every 6 minutes. Somebody dies for their faith. And some people still wonder if the church is going to go through the tribulation. Now, what will be the result of this persecution? Verse 10, Jesus continues here. He says, and then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So in this panoramic view of the future, Jesus tells us that all these things are going to happen before the end, but it is not yet the end. They're only birth pains, and they increase with frequency and intensity as time goes on, as the day approaches. So when do these birth pangs begin? What was the kickoff date for these things? Well, based on the condition of our world today, it's pretty easy to see that they're all happening now. I don't think anybody would argue with that. But the Bible tells us that the last days began when Jesus came the first time. Right from the day of Pentecost, these is what was identified as the beginning of the last days. John was the only apostle who was not martyred out of the 12. And instead, he was exiled to the Isle of Patmos, where he wrote the book of Revelation, in which he acknowledged that he and his audience were already in the tribulation. Revelation 1:9, these are John's words. I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation and the kingdom and the patient endurance that are in Christ, was on the Isle of Patmos on account of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. A lot of people just miss that verse. They go right to chapter 4 and skip the first 3 chapters of Revelation. But John says, hey, you know what? This is it. We're in the tribulation. So he's on the island Patmos. So according to John, what he identifies as the tribulation had begun, and every generation of Christians ever since has been subjected to everything Jesus had described thus far in this passage in Matthew 24. The only difference is the frequency and intensity of these events. Well, these events are unmistakable. Verses 15 through 26. Now, in answer to the first part of the disciples' question, when will these things be? He now gives them a single sign to watch for. And it's an unmistakable event. It's one of the birth pangs, but it's an unmistakable event that for a Jew is unimaginable. And that's the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. He says in verse 15, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Or what is it we're supposed to understand? This is the place where most people just kind of start scratching their heads and going, I don't understand. So Jesus directs us to Daniel if we don't understand. So let's go there. It seems pretty obvious to me, at least, that here Jesus connects this event with the prophecy in Daniel 9:26 through 27, which Chris just read for us this morning. This is the famous prophecy referred to as the 70 weeks of Daniel, and that would take several messages to unpack. We're not going to do that today, but I do want to dip into a couple of things that will help us better understand the Olivet Discourse. In this passage of the 70 weeks of Daniel, Daniel prophesies that after the Messiah comes, the temple will be destroyed by the people of the prince who is to come. It says that specifically. Now, in this passage, 26b and verse 27, Daniel chapter 9, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. And he, which is referring to the Messiah, shall make a strong covenant with the many for 1 week, and for half the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offerings. Just by the way, did Jesus put an end to sacrifice and offerings? Sure he did when he went to the cross. Paid the penalty for our sins, and nobody's offering sacrifices anymore. And on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Now, up to this point in his discourse, Jesus has been describing future events in very vivid literal terms. There's no symbolism, there's no hyperbole, there's no figurative language here at all. But here's where the fallacy of equivocation leads to alternative answers like we saw in our quiz a few minutes ago. Notice this word desolation, both in Jesus and in Daniel's words, his prophecy. It means to be laid waste and completely destroyed. That's what the word desolation means. But there are those who insist that desolation means desecration, believing that sometime in the future there will be a third temple and that it'll be desecrated or defiled by the Antichrist sacrificing a pig on the altar. Now, to support this view, they reach back into the Old Testament and pull out the prophecies that speak of the rebuilding of the second temple in 516 BC after the Babylonian exile, and then they misapply those prophecies to the building of a third temple sometime in the future. Jesus, who is the fulfillment of Daniel's messianic prophecy in chapter 9, the 70 weeks prophecy, reveals that the destruction of the temple is something that his generation would witness. And by generation, he literally means those who were alive at that time, those that he was speaking to face to face. So when he made this prediction, the second temple, also known as Herod's temple, it's referring to the same temple, Herod's temple had been undergoing a massive renovation and remodeling project started by Herod the Great 46 years earlier. So this thing had been under construction for 46 years. The construction site was considered to be so holy that only ceremonially clean Levite priests were employed as builders. And it took 1,000 of them over 35 more years to complete the work in AD 63. When it was completed, Herod's temple was a magnificent architectural structure made of gleaming white marble adorned with decorative gold overlay. So in AD 70, when 4 Roman legions, the people of the prince who is to come, destroyed Jerusalem and set fire to the temple, the gold liquefied in the heat and seeped into the joints of the stonework. These unclean, sacrilegious, pagan Roman soldiers swarmed the Temple Mount, trampled the inner courts, profaned the altar, defiled the sanctuary, desecrated the Holy of Holies, and tore down the temple stone by stone to plunder the melted gold, thereby razing the building right down to the bare pavement. Now, more likely than not, this is the literal fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy, the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel that Matthew wants his readers to understand. There are those who would disagree, but I'm yet to see evidence that would convince me otherwise. According to Daniel, this desolation is brought about by a flood of an invading army in the time of war. Nevertheless, those who misconstrue desolation to mean desecration also insist that the abomination of desolation is a person, not an event. And that person is the one who brings this about is the prince who is to come, who they insist is the Antichrist. But is he? See, history tells us that the one who actually came on the wing of abominations and made desolate and brought complete destruction in Daniel 9:27 was the Roman general Titus Flavius Vespasianus, the son of the emperor Vespasian Caesar, and heir to the throne. Titus was given command of 4 Roman legions and ordered by his father to destroy Jerusalem and crush the Jewish rebellion that broke out against Rome in AD 66. Now, the national symbol of Rome is an eagle. So each Roman legion carried a standard bearing the image of a winged eagle, a bird that was an unclean and detestable abomination to the Jews. So on the wings of abomination, Titus and his legions swept into Jerusalem like an overwhelming flood and destroyed the city and the sanctuary in AD 70, thus fulfilling Jesus' prophecy and Daniel's prophecy. Now, if the people of the prince who is to come, who destroyed the city and the sanctuary in verse 26, are Roman soldiers, then we can reasonably infer that their prince is the Roman emperor to whom they've sworn allegiance. Since that's the case, we can also infer that the prince who is to come is a future Roman emperor, thus making Titus, who succeeded his father as emperor in AD 79, is probably the most likely suspect for being the unnamed prince who is to come, the one who makes desolate and brings a complete destruction in Daniel chapter 9. Now, all this strongly suggests then that the abomination of desolation that Matthew wants us to understand is the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Now, a further problem for the equivocators is that nowhere in the New Testament do we find any indication that the temple will be rebuilt. Jesus doesn't mention it. None of the apostles mention it. It's not in Revelation anywhere. Throughout the New Testament, it's very clear that under the new covenant from Pentecost on, the temple of God is now the church and always will be the church. Well, what will it be for the generation that actually sees this happen that Jesus is referring to? Verse 16, he says, "Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, 'Look, here's the Christ,' or 'There he is,' do not believe it. For false prophets, or false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead many astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, 'Look, he's in the wilderness,' do not go out. If they say, 'Look, he's in the inner rooms,' do not believe him." So how's this all going to end? I mean, what else are we to look for? Well, there are undeniable signs in verses 27 through 25. Jesus says, "For as lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather." Now, at this point, as we pointed out last week, his coming will be as conspicuous and as sudden as a thunderstorm, but it's not going to be secret. The second coming is going to be as sudden as lightning and as conspicuous as vultures gathering to feed on a dead carcass. That's kind of a weird illustration, but if you see vultures all gathered around, you don't really have to wonder why they're doing that, do you? It's pretty obvious. There's something died. I mean, nothing else is going to cause that. So it's a vivid kind of illustration, so there's no question about what Jesus is talking about here. Now, up to this point, Jesus has been speaking in very little literal terms, describing the actual events that he calls birth pains leading up to his coming. But here, in verses 29 through 31, he intentionally uses more figurative, apocalyptic language to describe the details that have not yet been fully revealed about the second coming. He says in verse 29, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other." Now, this sounds like something you would read out of the book of Revelation, isn't it? This is apocalyptic language. He's gone from very literal, descriptive language about the things that are very obvious to apocalyptic language to things that have not yet all been revealed and are still part of the second coming. Well, then after painting this apocalyptic picture of the second coming, he then gives us a brief parable about a fig tree. Verse 32, he says, "From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." what in the world is Jesus talking about? So we just skip it and move on, This generation that Jesus is referring to certainly means those who are alive at the time. They are the ones who will see all these things take place. Without question, that generation saw the destruction of the temple and experienced the persecution that immediately followed. But what about the rest of it? The universe hasn't fallen apart. The Lord has not returned. So what does Jesus mean by all these things? The key to identifying all these things is tucked away right here in this little one-sentence parable, and then the one-sentence explanation that Jesus gives. In the parable, summer is when the figs are ripe and are ready for harvest. Everything that precedes the harvest, the tender branches and the new leaves, all point to summer. They all have to happen leading up to summer, but it doesn't include summer. Little words, so also, in verse 33, makes the explanation parallel to this. Verse 33 then tells us that summer is equal to the second coming. And all these things are the birth pains leading up to that second coming, but they don't include the second coming. See, everything leading up to this you will see. Everything leading up to this is going to happen, but they don't include the second coming. The branches and the leaves aren't the harvest. Now, the equivocators, who insist they take the Bible literally, have concluded that this parable of the fig tree is referring to the birth of the nation of Israel in 1948. Now, I can assure you that in the 1900 years prior to 1948, no one would have ever drawn that conclusion. There are also those who believe that all these things means everything described without exception, including the second coming, which they insist happened in AD 70. They're called preterists. And preterism is an aberrant, unorthodox view that has always been rejected by the church, and for one glaringly obvious reason. Can you take a guess why? Jesus has not yet returned. See? But apart from that, the generation to whom Jesus was speaking witnessed all these things as we do today. And what we see is the increased frequency and intensity of these birth pains. Every generation has experienced some measure and some degree of the kind of tribulation and persecution Jesus described. The only things that have not yet happened are the rapture and the resurrection and the second coming. But they will. Verse 35, Jesus says, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." Well, the timing, of course, is unexpected. Verses 36 through 39. Now, I believe the reason that Jesus shifted from literal to figurative language in verse 29 becomes more clear in this last section of our passage this morning. He's provided us with a sense of the sequence of events, but not with a sense of the exact timing of these events. He's told us what will take place, but not precisely when they'll take place. Some of these things have happened, they are happening, and they will continue to happen before he returns at the end of the age. Verse 36, he says, "But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father." It's amazing how many times in stuff that I read, people predicting the end of the world and pinpointing the dates of when Jesus will return. People respond and say, "No one knows." I say, well, that's not what that means. We can't know the day or the hour, but we can know the month and the year kind of thing. No, Jesus is saying nobody knows. And as we saw in Acts chapter 1 last week, when the disciples asked this question, Jesus literally said, "It's none of your business. It is not for you to know the things that the Father has chosen not to disclose." There's no way anyone can guess or ascertain more information about the second coming beyond what Jesus himself has revealed. So any of these modern day apocalyptic ear ticklers who claim to know precisely when Jesus will return is a false teacher. Pay no attention to them because, according to Jesus, no one knows. They are lying. Verse 37, he says, "For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man." No one knows. Even in the midst of tumultuous, uncertain times, life still goes on, doesn't it? There's a sense of normalcy in people's day-to-day routines that even though the world is in chaos, but when the Lord returns, there will be no warning. And those who are not ready will be swept away in judgment. But for believers, those of us who are ready and who are expecting the Lord to return, who are expecting to see Jesus face to face on that day, that is our blessed hope. Seeing Jesus face to face. We cannot afford to equivocate or make up our own answers based on foregone conclusions and presuppositions that can't be found anywhere in the Bible. Our hope is not a secret rapture that rescues us from tribulation. Our blessed hope is that after we have endured to the end, we will see Jesus face to face and hear the words, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your master." In the meantime, that hope sustains us and has a purifying effect on how we live our lives in these last days.